So now I'd like to discuss a few historical examples of epidemiology in practice. I begin with the story of smallpox. So smallpox is a viral infection that, depending on the form, can be lethal. It dates back to 10,000 BC. However, the initial source of the virus has yet to be discovered. And in the late 1700s, there was a pandemic of smallpox. A pandemic is defined as an epidemic of a disease spread across multiple regions. We will discuss that later. And during this pandemic, mortality was between 20 and 60%. It was also being observed that there was known immunity from reinfection among people who had been infected with smallpox and survived. So also what was being observed at that time was that young women who were milking cows were acquiring a more mild form of a virus known as cowpox. But that more importantly, those same women, those same dairymaids who had had cowpox were not developing smallpox during smallpox outbreaks. And Edward Jenner, who was a physician practicing in England, was observing this as well. And he believed that cowpox could potentially be protecting people against smallpox. So he developed this idea of variolation, which was to take infected cowpox pus and infect a healthy individual to see if they then subsequently developed smallpox. It's an idea of variolating an individual. So in 1778, Jenner decides to test this hypothesis by inoculating an 8-year-old volunteer named James Phillips with cowpox material that Jenner acquired from a dairymaid. 6 weeks later, Jenner exposes the boy to smallpox infection, and lo and behold, the young boy does not develop smallpox. This was known as the first vaccination, and this picture here is a rendering from that time, illustrating Jenner's administration of the cowpox pus to the young boy. And as we all know now, smallpox is a disease for which we have a vaccine for. It's not eradicated, but it's essentially does not exist in the natural setting. The next example I want to discuss is that of cholera. So cholera is a bacterial infection of the small intestine that's due to the Vibrio cholera bacterium. And here is a picture of the Vibrio cholera, which are very distinct in image. The symptoms of cholera are pretty distinct. They are watery rice-like diarrhea, vomiting, muscle cramps, usually 1 to 5 days after exposure. The disease can present in a mild form and can be severe as well. Among those who are untreated, the mortality rate could be as high as 50%. And it has been nicknamed the Blue Death because it turns one's skin a bluish-gray color due to the loss of fluids. So in the mid-19th century, cholera was a major public health problem in England, particularly. This is a picture of a sign posted in a cemetery in Dudley, England in 1839, essentially saying that they had no more room for any future bodies because they were filled up from all the cholera cases that were occurring. There was a gentleman named William Farr at the same time who was the Vital Statistics Registrar General. He's also viewed as the founder of modern statistics. And he believed that the cholera disease was being spread or transmitted via a cloud or a miasma idea of this cloud of infection that's clinging low to the earth. He hypothesized that individuals living or functioning at a greater altitude could be protected against cholera compared to those who were living at a lower altitude. And he presented these data, which were from actual cases of cholera, illustrating a correlation between elevation from sea level and case count. Elevation illustrated on the x-axis and case count on the y-axis, illustrating a clear trend downwards as elevation goes up. Also at that time was an individual named John Snow, who was the physician to Queen Victoria, and he believed differently. He thought that cholera was actually being transmitted through contaminated water, specifically that one was ingesting water that had been contaminated from fecal material. He further felt that it was associated with where water was coming from, and there were different public water companies at the time who were taking water from the river and transporting it to public water points. What's important to note is that in 1852, one of the three main water companies, the Lambeth Water Company, moved their water intake upriver towards a non-polluted source, and that was after a cholera outbreak that had occurred in 1849. And this is a picture of John Snow. So in 1854, there's a major cholera outbreak in London. It began in August of that year on a Monday with a woman washing clothes from her baby and emptying that dirty water into a cesspool in front of the house. That baby subsequently died on that Saturday, and after which 700 cases of cholera ensued. John Snow hypothesized that the cases and the deaths that were occurring were lower in households who were acquiring their water from the Lambeth Company compared to those acquiring the water from other companies. And the following Tuesday, John Snow embarks out on the first known epidemiologic investigation, where he goes from household to household to obtain names and addresses of both individuals infected with cholera as well as those infected and who had died. This is otherwise known as shoe leather epidemiology. And this is a plotting of John Snow's case count by map. And what you notice here is a clustering of cases around Broad Street. So John Snow discovers after that those affected with cholera had actually fetched their water from what was known as the Broad Street Pump. This is a picture of it in modern times. So he attends a local meeting of public health officials and board members that following Thursday, and he demands that the community remove the handle of that Broad Street Pump so that no more people can acquire water from that source. The board members agreed, but they still favored the miasma theory over John Snow's theory of contaminated water. And these next two slides just provide those data more detail from that particular outbreak and other outbreaks of that same time. This slide illustrates that ultimately the highest number of deaths from cholera were associated with water coming from Southwark. And as was later discovered, Southwark was acquiring their water from a lower point on the Thames River such that it was more contaminated. Now, while the Board of Governors agreed to removal of that Broad Street pump handle, they still didn't believe John Snow. And actually, 1 year after John Snow died in 1855, Reverend Whitehead sought out to disprove John Snow's theory. And he ultimately failed because he did discover and confirm that those who drink water from the Broad Street pump had developed cholera. Much larger number of those had developed cholera, 58%, compared to those who acquired their water from another source, 7%. And subsequent to that, there was an engineering survey that found that a constant leak from the cesspool to the Broad Street pump shaft had occurred. Again, confirming the John Snow theory that water was being contaminated. The next example I will give is that of the story of specter of death among pregnant women. And this occurred in 1847. It was a young physician named Ignaz Semmelweis who found that among medical student-run obstetric clinics that the mortality rate from puerperal fever was as high as 3 times that of the mortality rate in clinics that were being run by midwives. And puerperal fever was a condition that was occurring among pregnant women. Semmelweis examined reasons for this imbalance, and he concluded that the medical students were carrying something from the mortuary and autopsy labs to the clinics. So he ordered those students to wash their hands with chlorinated lime solution. And this intervention led to a dramatic drop in the mortality rate from 18% to 1%. This is one of the first known interventional studies performed that illustrate it was an epidemiologic interventional study showing a change, a very rapid change in an endpoint. And the last example I will give is that of Typhoid Mary. This is in the early 1900s. Now, typhoid is a life-threatening illness caused by a gram-negative bacterium, Salmonella typhi. And there was this Irish cook, Mary Malone, who was working as a cook in several homes in the United States, New York specifically. And in these homes, several individuals were becoming infected or sickened with typhoid during her employment and after her employment. Health officials observed this trend, and they actually confined Typhoid Mary, or Mary at the time, for a period of 3 years. And upon her release in 1910, she suddenly disappeared. However, 2 years later, 200 people were affected with typhoid, and she was found to be working again in the same hospitals where those people were affected, but under a different name. She voluntarily accepted isolation at that point and subsequently died in isolation at age 70. But this incident essentially forced public health officials to implement some sort of tracking system for people who were carriers of infectious agents.